Hello, my name is Kevin Ruane. I'm Professor of Modern History at Canterbury Christ Church University, and I'm giving a short lecture now on the role of the atomic bomb and the onset of the Cold War in Asia. Now, for most people, the atomic bombing of Japan, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, is regarded as the last military act of the Second World War. And indeed, for many years, not just the wider public, but historians very largely accepted the reasons for the use of the atomic bomb that were given at the time by President Harry S. Truman. So what did Truman say? Truman said the bombs were used essentially for two reasons. First, to end the war against Japan quickly, and secondly, to save lives. Now, that might seem perverse given the horrendous casualty figures that we know that Hiroshima and Nagasaki contained, but Truman's logic was pretty much as follows. If the atomic bombs had not ended the war, there would have had to be an invasion of Japan, and Truman expected that invasion to cost countless Allied casualties, not to mention Japanese casualties as well. So the bomb, by ending the war within 10 days of the first atomic bomb essentially, effectively saved 18 months of conventional fighting, 18 months of dying in very large numbers, not just Americans, but also Japanese. That, at any rate, was Truman's logic, and so it went for some 3 years, until in 1948, a scientist, a British scientist by the name of Patrick Blackett, working at Manchester University, a scientist, moreover, who had been part of the British mission to something called the Manhattan Project during the Second World War, which was the predominantly American effort to harness the power of nature in a bomb. Blackett published a book called, I'll give you the title, Fear, War and the Atomic Bomb, in which he made a very bold claim. He said that Japan was already essentially defeated in August 1945, and the atomic bombs did not need to be used. Why then were they used? Well, Blackett had an answer. The reason they were used was to impress Stalin and the Soviet Union with America's awesome new power, and having impressed Stalin, that atomic power would then be converted into diplomatic leverage as the Americans struggled to deal with Stalin and the Red Army and their conquest of Eastern Europe. This atomic power would be used as a lever to prise Stalin's grip away from Eastern Europe and to get the Red Army, intimidate them back into barracks, etc., etc. So this was a very controversial thesis to articulate, and of course by 1948, when the book comes out, the Cold War itself is now very much joined. Now, by the 1960s, Blackett's view, which had been a kind of niche view through the 1950s, began to gain greater traction as a new generation of American Cold War scholars, younger scholars with greater access to primary source material, began to take up his essential thesis and amplify and develop it. And these so-called revisionist historians, looking back on that 1945 decision, this fundamental moment, not just at the end of the Second World War, but at the outset, essentially, of the Cold War as well, they discovered that Truman had other options available to him, other than the use of the atomic bomb, and that these options weren't just paper options, he knew about them. He didn't use them, he chose the bomb. But what were the options? Option number one was an invasion of Japan. That was on the cards. The planning date was the 1st of November 1945. Now, even revisionist historians accepted that that was an alternative, but it wasn't an attractive alternative. It was going to cause an awful lot of lost lives on the Allied side, not to mention the Japanese side. Option number two was to continue current policy a bit longer. What you need to know about Japan in early August 1945 was that for the previous 6 months, the US Air Force had been bombing Japanese cities fairly mercilessly, some 60 Japanese cities between February and August 1945 had been incinerated by conventional bombardment. Beyond that, the US Navy, the Japanese Navy no longer effectively existed, the American Navy had, since the start of the year, been surrounding Japan and implementing a naval blockade which was effectively starving the Japanese people, preventing the importation of food and other vital resources. Put it together, you're being bombed from the air, you're being strangled by this sea blockade. The Japanese were in a very poor state, and Truman was made aware that simply continuing current policy could bring about Japan's surrender. That was the second alternative. The third alternative was to wait and see what happened when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. Under an agreement reached between President Roosevelt, Truman's predecessor, and Stalin at the Yalta conference at the start of 1945, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. Now that gives us August 8th, because the war in Europe ends on the 8th of May. So 3 months on, we've got ourselves August 8. Truman is told by his military chiefs that Soviet entry might be, on its own, the thing that levers an already helpless and hopeless Japanese into capitulation. Wait and see what happens. The fourth alternative was to change the surrender terms. Allied policy since the start of 1943 was something called unconditional surrender. Now, the United States knew from intercepting Japanese diplomatic traffic and decoding it that the Japanese, by the summer of 1945, were looking for a way to surrender. They saw their situation was hopeless, but unconditional surrender was a real problem because it implied, unconditional surrender implied, that the emperor, for example, the Mikado, Hirohito, who wasn't just an emperor, he was a living god, the embodiment of Japanese culture and religion. Unconditional surrender meant that he could well be tried and indeed executed as a war criminal. Truman was advised, or Truman came to know, that simply changing the surrender terms to give the Japanese an assurance about the emperor might on its own bring about an early end to the war. Lots of alternatives. Truman decides to use the atomic bomb. Why was that? We come back to the Blackett thesis. The revisionists of the 60s and the 70s argued that it was not about ending the war against Japan. Japan was essentially defeated. It was about impressing the socks off Joseph Stalin so that he would then be so cowed as to pull his Red Army out of Eastern Europe, and Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and all those other countries would be allowed to proceed down a democratic and a free road. Didn't work. Stalin merely reached for the Iron Curtain and the Cold War would ensue. Now today, not many historians accept the old orthodox view. In fact, very few would accept that the bombs were used for purely military reasons in the context of the war against Japan. Not many historians agree with that. Probably most historians these days would say that the bombs were used partly for the reasons Truman said at the time. They were used to end the war quickly and to save lives. But Truman and those around him were fully conscious of the diplomatic payoff that testing, demonstrating, showing off America's new power could have in the struggle for mastery in Europe, particularly the struggle to actually free Eastern Europe from the grip of the Red Army. But those historians that see a role for the bomb there regard that as a bonus. The primary reason for using the bomb was to end the war quickly, save lives, but there could be a diplomatic payoff. That's a real contrast with the old revisionists who said that impressing Stalin was the be-all and end-all. That was the real driver of US policy. Well, the debate 70 plus years on shows no real sign of ending or being resolved in a definitive way, and more recent research suggests that more even than the atomic bombs, it was indeed Soviet entry into the war that most impressed the emperor and his chief war advisors and brought about the Japanese surrender on the 14th of August 1945. But whichever way you look at it, I think the atomic bombing of Japan operates as a rather important bridge between the Second World War and the Cold War that followed.